Tonight I'll be talking about the Canadian Corps and the battles of the 100 Days, which we know today is the anniversary of the Battle of Amiens. This is in support of an exhibition we are doing here at the War Museum, which Carolyn has already talked about. That'll open at the end of October. It's going to be a fabulous exhibition. It will be about those battles, richly illustrated. We have works of art, we have powerful artifacts, we have reconstructions, we have films, and all of it underpinned by the incredible stories of Canadians in battle, in combat, how they fought, how they survived, how they endured, how they killed, and how they died. I'm excited to share some of the research with you tonight, most of which, the images behind me, are drawn from our collection. And one of the things this exhibition is going to do is to present colorized photographs. We think of the First World War largely as a black and white war. How different it looks when it's colorized. As a historian who's looked at these images many, many times, I see new things there. But I think most importantly as a reminder that despite the fact that this generation has passed away, they are like us. They were our great-grandfathers, our grandfathers, for some in the room, perhaps fathers, great-grandmothers. And it's been a pleasure to work on this exhibition. I was off work, as many of you know, for some time with an illness, and I've come back to work on this. We have a fantastic team. There's a core team, but in fact, the entire museum contributes to these exhibitions. I won't mention everyone, but I will single out Dr. Jack Granestein. It is an absolute pleasure for a young or relatively young scholar to have a chance to work with Jack, to listen to his stories, to hear his wisdom. He has indeed written 75 books. That's incredible. That's one a year, Jack, for your life. Although I don't know what you were doing between the ages of 1 and 3, but it's a real pleasure to talk about this exhibition, and I hope you will come both for the opening and also to view it after that. It will run until late March. I won't offer a preamble of the war or the battles fought between 1915 and 1917, but we'll be coming into the story after the terrible Battle of Passchendaele, fought by the British from the 31st of July, 1917, and then by the Canadian Corps in October and November of 1917. You can see the images here. You remember the stories of Passchendaele, the sea of mud and unburied corpses. In the aftermath of the grim fighting, where the Canadian Corps captured that ridge and helped to end that terrible campaign, but also suffered 16,000 casualties, the Canadian Corps limped back to Vimy Ridge to defend its part of the line. In early 1918, as a result of the casualties to the BEF, to the British forces, there was a manpower shortage throughout the BEF. Difficult decisions had to be made, and the War Office decided to take the severe step of reducing the number of battalions in an infantry division, usually about 17 or 18,000 strong at full strength, from 12 infantry battalions to 9, to create a number of weaker formations. This was a desperate change for the British. It tore infantry battalions out of their home divisions, it weakened morale, and it created a number of weaker formations. Now, the British were hoping to do the same thing with the Canadians, and they approached the Canadian Corps commander, Sir Arthur Currie, seen here, if he too would reduce the 4 Canadian infantry divisions from 12 to 9 battalions to create 2 new divisions. They tried to sweeten the pot with Currie by offering him, or hinting at least, that he would be given command of the 6 Canadian divisions, the 2 corps, and possibly be an army commander, the only Dominion army commander. Currie had a reputation among the British for being difficult because he fought for the Canadians. He fought for his soldiers. And he surprised everyone by refusing to reduce his infantry battalions. Now, the backstory on Currie is fascinating. He was a militia officer before the war. He was in Victoria. He was a land developer. In fact, he was a land speculator. He had a good head. He had a big body. You can see the uniform here. He was a big man at about 250 pounds. He never quite looked like a general, but he had a good head. He understood the warfare in front of him. He understood he was not brilliant. He often said that. He listened to his British staff officers. And he continued to learn throughout the war. He was a learner, and he instilled that in the Canadian Corps as he rose from brigadier to divisional commander to take command of the Corps in June of 1917. In the end, Currie's principal stand allowed his 4 infantry divisions to retain their 12 battalions and to be at full strength. And these, with the addition of the conscripts Jack talked about from the summer of 1918, provided key manpower for the Corps. Currie was also able to wrangle from the British more trucks, increased engineering units, mortar teams, all of which added to the combat power of the Canadian Corps. To move from the Canadians then to the strategic picture, the Allied forces had withstood the German offensives of March 1918. This was the last desperate gamble by the Germans to knock the Allies out of the war, at least to make them sue for peace before the Americans came in strength. And in fact, while the French and the British had taken horrendous casualties, they had weathered that storm and even counterattacked at the Second Battle of Marne in July of 1918. That battle with French and American troops delivered a severe blow, revealing that the Germans, who themselves had lost 800,000 soldiers killed and wounded in their offensives, were unable to absorb heavy punishment. Now, some scholars suggest that the 100 Days Campaign should be known as the 117 Days Campaign, to include the story of Second Marne, although I see them as linked but different campaigns. To add perhaps to the confusion of the discussion, the 100 Days Campaign is actually 96 days. The new Allied Supreme Commander, General Ferdinand Foch, a French general, ordered a new assault after Second Marne. And British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig decided to strike east of Amiens. Amiens was an absolutely crucial logistical city. And when we begin to look at some of these battles of Amiens and later on Cambrai, we see the importance of logistics on the Western Front, something that historians don't pay enough attention to. And it would be the Canadians and the Australians who would form the spearhead of Fourth Army's assault. There's no laser on this. Okay, you can see the advances of the Germans in their 5 major offensives, the checkered numbers there, and Amiens is about center of France. That's where the Canadians will attack from the east of that. In a logistical marvel, the 100,000-strong Canadian Corps arrived to the Amiens battlefield in time for the offensive on the 8th of August. They had very little time to prepare for this. But they moved the Corps, and they revealed a level of professionalism that had been reached after 4 long years of war. The equivalent of moving 100,000 soldiers was like transporting a large Canadian city to a specific spot in a French farmer's field. A strategic deception plan also threw off the enemy, as the Germans had long regarded the Canadians as an attack formation, and sign of them at the front was often an indication of coming battle. The Canadians were able to obscure their arrival, and in one of those interesting twists that historians really like, each Canadian soldier had pasted into his paybook a note that said, "Keep your mouth shut." We found one of those in our own collection, and that will be on display in our exhibition. The trench system to the east of Amiens was poorly constructed and not prepared in depth. The German forces there were relatively weak, at least those in the front line. There were stronger ones as reserve counterattack formations. But what they did have was hundreds of machine gun teams all along the front. Now, these were never easy to knock out. They always required tremendous courage and a sacrifice of blood. But the successful Canadian way of battle, honed after years of hard lessons, was the coordination and the combination of artillery and infantry along with tanks, armored cars, mobile mortar teams, cavalry, and airplanes. And this is quite a nice photograph from our collection. It's a training photograph of the Canadians with a tank. You can see it's training because they're not wearing their helmets. They were training throughout the summer of 1918, the strong, hitting Canadian Corps of 100,000 soldiers to engage in open warfare. This would be very different than the trench warfare of 1915 to 1917, characterized by the deep trenches, the stalemated front, the rats, and the lice. Well, they still had lots of lice in 1918. The Canadians would also attack at Amiens with 168 tanks attached to the Corps. Now, it's amazing to think, I think, the Canadians fought with tanks, 6 tanks, once on the Battle of the Somme on the 15th of September, and they fought with 9 tanks at the Battle of Vimy Ridge on the 9th of April. And they didn't fight with tanks at any other point. So this was quite revolutionary for the Canadians, and they had tanks in large numbers. They prepared for the assault. And this is a battle map from Nicholson, the official history, 60 years old and still an absolutely essential work. And you can see the Canadians up in the top left corner. They will be attacking downwards, and you can see the number of battalions that are going to be engaged in this assault. The silence was broken on the morning of the 8th at 4:20 as the Allied artillery opened fire. The whole sky lit up. I never saw anything like it in my life. That barrage on the 8th of August. You couldn't hear yourself think, said one Canadian. Along the Canadian front, 3 assault divisions got away rapidly, encountering little immediate resistance as the infantry followed the rapid-moving, creeping barrage of shells that tore up the enemy lines and the barbed wire. The tank charge shocked the enemy, but the Germans had effective anti-tank defenses, doctrine, and weapons. They used mortars and field guns in a direct fire role. And while the tanks were successful in overrunning a number of crucial positions, and this is very clear in the official reports of the Canadian forces, they were also very vulnerable on the battlefield. The German defenders were also armed with the first anti-tank rifle. It fired a 13.2 millimeter round, and we have this in our collection. The shot, or the rebound from the shot, nearly tore off the shoulder, I've read, but they did significant damage to the Allied tanks. More damaging for the Allied tanks was the fact that the exhaust from the tanks emptied partially into the enclosed area, and that the heat within there was between 40 and 50 degrees. And so within a few hours, most of those tankers or troopers were sick and unable to continue. Nonetheless, the open warfare was a great success, but it was not a rout. Throughout the day, the fighting became more intense, and the Canadian losses mounted, especially as the infantry outdistanced the protective artillery barrage. And I've always loved this photograph. It seems to me that the Canadian soldiers look to be about 18 years old, and the German soldiers look to be about 16 years old. It gives a sense, I think, of how all of the forces are down to the bone at this point, reinforcing Jack's point, and how Canada, but in fact every country at war, is on the verge of breaking. The assault on the 8th, which lasted for much of the day, saw the Canadians advance 13 kilometers. It was an astonishing gain for the Western Front, where advances in the past were measured in hundreds of meters. The Germans had been rocked. But the challenge for the Allies was mounting another set-piece battle the next day to transform the break-in to a break-out. By the early hours of the 9th, the Canadian infantry were spread out over the battlefield. As Jack has mentioned, 3,800 Canadians wounded or killed, those who could walk, hobbling to the rear, those who required to be carried out, requiring 4 stretcher bearers to carry them out. I have read ghastly accounts of soldiers crawling back, missing legs and arms, realizing that they were pulling themselves back and that the only way they would survive the next couple of hours is if they somehow found a medical officer somewhere to the rear. Everywhere there was confusion. The artillery was now far behind the lines and had to be dragged forward. Surprise was lost, and the Germans rushed in reinforcements. The attack on the 9th continued to witness fierce fighting. Machine guns plagued the Canadians, and there were far fewer tanks. One Canadian soldier, Private Harold Becker, noted, passing 2 tanks that were on fire, "The crews were probably burning to a crisp inside, but we could do nothing for them." He had written earlier in his memoir how much he wanted to be in a tank because he thought it would be tremendous fun to drive over the Germans. After that, he didn't want to be in a tank again. Along the front, there were hundreds of individual life and death struggles in these wheat fields. For some, it was a cakewalk. For others, literally a death struggle where every man in the platoon was killed or wounded. The 29th Battalion, to provide one example, reported destroying and capturing over 40 German heavy machine guns on a frontage of 700 yards, advancing to about 2,000 yards. Each of those machine guns fired 400 to 500 bullets a minute. Each one had to be knocked out by grenades, by bullet, or bayonet. Private A.E. Smith of the 116th Battalion offered a soldier's view of the battle. He wrote, "The whole thing gave one the impression that a chunk of hell had broken loose." Currie's soldiers snatched another 6 kilometers from the enemy on the 9th, but they suffered another 2,500 casualties, adding to the 3,800 on the first day. Intense combat raged for several more days with less ground gained and fewer prisoners captured. And by August 13th, Currie and the Australian Corps commander, John Monash, appealed to their army commander, who eventually appealed to Haig to call off the offensive. No, the fighting would lead to no breakthrough, and the offensive came to an end. Amiens proved that a secret operation launched with aggressive troops employing sophisticated all-arms tactics could rupture the enemy lines. But the challenge of open warfare was not easily overcome, and organizing a second phase to a set-piece battle eluded the Allies. The challenges were significant. Logistics and communication constantly breaking down. Casualties significant and wearing the edge off the Canadian blade. The loss of surprise and the enemy rush in of reinforcements had all slowed down the attack on the 9th and the 10th. Nonetheless, the victory was significant. On the Canadian front alone, the Corps' 4 divisions met and defeated elements of 14 German divisions, capturing over 9,000 prisoners, 200 guns, 150 mortars, and 755 machine guns. Several thousand Germans were buried in mass graves. But there were no easy victories, and the Canadian Corps, of a little over 102,000 strong, suffered 11,822 casualties, with most of the losses falling on the infantry. That is true decimation, 1 in 10. The Germans were demoralized from the blow, and the Kaiser remarked later that the war could no longer be won. But that did not mean that the German army on the Western Front was going to give up. They were hoping to fight on until 1919. They were hoping to hold on a major defensive line, the Hindenburg Line, and that would be the place where the Canadians were thrown into battle. The shattered Canadian battalions were soon restored almost to full strength. We have images of conscripts here. Jack has talked about that, the conscripts playing a key role in bringing the infantry battalions back up to strength. And then the Canadians were moved to the Arras front near Vimy Ridge to spearhead another attack, this one by Sir Henry Horne's First Army. They would face the Hindenburg Line, which in fact was a series of trenches about 30 kilometers deep. It was based on isolated strong points anchored around concrete pillboxes with hundreds of machine guns and deep rows of barbed wire. The most formidable trench of many was the Drocourt-Quéant line, and further to the east was the unfinished Canal du Nord that incorporated marshland and numerous trench systems into its defenses. Beyond that was an additional series of trenches and the all-important city of Cambrai, a key logistical hub in which German supplies came in by road and by rail, and if the Germans lost Cambrai, they would have to retreat from this part of the front. The Allies would attack all along the Western Front. Amiens had surprised everyone, surprised the Germans, surprised the French, surprised the British. And at the end of the month, all of the Allied armies, American, British, Belgian, French, would begin a series of assaults. It was the Canadians, though, who spearheaded against this crucial position. Currie had about 2 weeks to prepare for the battle. In fact, less. About 1 week to prepare for the battle. He worked with Sir Henry Horne, who's seen here on the left with the cane, and you can see Currie turned to the profile. Horne and Currie were very different generals, but they got along quite well. Horne understood the Canadian Corps was different. It was, as one of his senior officers said, the backbone of his army, and he gathered artillery guns to support the Canadians. In fact, Currie said of Horne at one point, "He did everything that I asked of him." And I only say that to make it clear that it was the Canadians who fought as part of a British army. We were part of the British Expeditionary Force, and we were ably supported by the British. It's important to say that because I've heard it often said that the British were almost as fervent as the Germans in trying to kill off the Canadians. They weren't. That's not the case. But nor is it the case that the Canadians were just another corps in the British Army. They were not. The British relied heavily on these shock troops to deliver victory. Maurice Pope, a brigade major in an engineer brigade, later an important general in the Second World War, said of this battle, "Vimy took months of preparation. 4 days ago, I knew nothing of this affair, and this job is at least the equal magnitude." That's an important observation, and it speaks to the increased tempo of planning these operations. If we look for the difference in warfighting from 1918 to, say, 1917 or 1916, there's all kinds of changes with the infantry tactics, with the combined arms warfare, with more sophisticated artillery support, with better interaction between the planes circling and the gunners on the ground. All kinds of factors you can look at, but one of the key ones is the level of tempo. The battles move fast. The preparation moves fast. The Canadians can do this because they've been fighting together for 4 years. And this is one of the hidden secrets, I think, to why the Canadian Corps is so effective. And so the Canadians were preparing for the major attack against Arras on the 26th of August. And Currie planned to send 2 divisions into the line, having a brigade, about 4,500 men, fighting each day on the 26th, the 27th, and the 28th. The hope was that the Canadians would break through the trenches here, crash through the Drocourt-Quéant line, and keep going. But the Germans needed to defend this position, and the Germans stacked the front with defenders and with guns. And so when the Canadians attacked at 3 a.m. on the 26th of August, they had almost no surprise. The Germans knew they were coming. The only surprise was that Currie moved back the attack about 2 hours into 3 in the morning. Nonetheless, a barrage was fired from 762 Allied guns. British and Canadian counter-battery fire was effective. The German gunners were smothered in high explosives, shrapnel, and poison gas. At 0 hour, the Canadian infantry followed their creeping barrage through the enemy lines, breaking the outer crust defense before engaging in tougher, small unit actions. And I love this photograph. I think it is my favorite of all in our collection. This, to me, is the real deal. These Canadians are under fire. They're passing through a barrage. You can see one soldier stumbling, perhaps being shot, perhaps simply going to ground. They're moving forward in worm tactics. There's no longer the long lines of soldiers advancing on the enemy. These guys are trying to make ground to close with the enemy. The Germans fought just as hard. often long after their positions were surrendered, especially if machine gun teams survived to anchor the defense. And I think it's the machine gun which is absolutely crucial to understanding how the Germans hold out in these final battles. The machine gunners were there. They were elite troops. They often fired to the last bullet. They expected no quarter, and often no quarter was given. The fighting went on for nearly 3 days, and the Canadian units steadily wore down the Germans. They faced and withstood multiple counterattacks. This image I've always looked at before and just skimmed past it. When you colorize, I think it's fascinating to see the Canadian who is trying to make himself very small behind that tree, and then the dead German in the foreground who had never been able to see before in the black and white photographs. Those 3 days of constant battle saw the Canadians advance 3 or 4 kilometers through multiple trench systems, but at the cost of 6,000 casualties. Currie had pushed his soldiers hard, perhaps too hard, some of the poor, bloody infantry, as they like to call themselves, grumbled. And he paused on the 29th for several days to unleash a new set-piece battle against the Drocourt-Quéant line. They gathered the guns together, they pulled together the shells, they planned the operation. Canadian units in the front lines raided the Germans relentlessly. And then at 4:50 a.m. on the 2nd of September, the Canadians assaulted. I like this photograph very much as well, because it shows urban warfare. A lot of these battles take place in French villages and cities. And it's quite rare. I think we often think of all the battles happening in French farmer fields. That was the case with Amiens. Arras is quite different. Canal du Nord will be different as well. The Canadians punched their way forward. The Germans counterattacked relentlessly, but they could not reverse the tide. Infantryman J.P. Van de Walter wrote, "Fritz had his best troops against us, and they were in very strong positions. Our casualties were very heavy, and some of the best have gone, but we absolutely fought him to a finish and beat him at every turn." The day ended in mass German surrenders and a pullout all along the line. During the Arras battle, the Canadians had defeated 7 German divisions, captured 11,000 prisoners, countless guns, machine guns, 927 machine guns. I mean, think of that. Each of them firing 400 to 500 bullets a minute, all of them having to be knocked out. And of course, it cost the Canadians a terrible price, another 12,000 casualties, 25,000 casualties from the 8th of August to the 2nd of September. That's 25,000 casualties in less than a month. 1 in 4 of all the Canadian soldiers were killed or wounded, and almost all of those casualties fell to the infantry, the machine gunners, or those in the tanks. War weariness was, oh, look at that book. That's my new book coming out next month, which talks about war weariness, coping and enduring. That was very smooth, wasn't it? The Canadians, I got ahead of myself there, I lost an image. The Canadians prepared for another assault to push through forward to the Hindenburg Line. They were blocked by the Canal du Nord, which you can see in the bottom left corner, but their objective was Cambrai, that essential logistical town. If it fell, the Germans would be in full retreat. The German soldiers were given orders to fight to the death. Now, these orders are often issued by the high command, but they were to not retreat. And in fact, the Germans stacked their counterattacking forces here. Currie had about 3 weeks to plan for this battle, and he didn't like it. He'd lost 1/4 of his force. The Germans had flooded the entire region, or most of the region at least. Intelligence patrols and airplanes indicated that, however, there was a dry gap of about 2,600 yards. Now that sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot to put 100,000 men through. And if the Canadians were stopped there, passing through the canal, they would be slaughtered. And this is an amazing Amazing for me, because I'm a bit of a geek on these things. Amazing photograph of Currie as Corps Commander. We have partners on our exhibition with the National Film Board. Fabulous to work with these professionals, and they dug this out of their archives, and I'm not sure it's been seen before. And we're going to do a feature in the exhibition looking at Currie and the challenges that he faced. His own Army commander, Horn, came to him and said, "It's too dangerous of an operation. Don't send your corps through there. If you are stopped, your Canadians will be annihilated and you will be sent home in disgrace." Currie pondered it, and he decided to attack. He had faith in his soldiers. He had faith in his combat engineers. Once the lead Canadian infantry units passed over the canal, the combat engineers were to follow behind them to build bridges. But this was a very difficult operation. After 3 weeks of intense planning and preparation, artillery bombardments, the 1st and the 4th Division attacked at 5:20 on the 27th of September behind a creeping barrage supplied by 785 guns. They made it across the canal. They annihilated the German defenders on the other side, and then they fanned out, pushing forward into Bourlon Wood. I wish this had a laser, but Bourlon Wood in the bottom corner, and then fanning out. You can see the wave of infantry as they sweep upwards. The key thing, though, was the engineers who were to build bridges for the tanks, for the trucks, for the artillery, of which they did, and also for the infantry, and under fire. And they did that, and the Canadians were able to press the fight. German strongpoints and gun batteries were saturated with shrapnel, high explosives gas, and smoke. Smoke becomes very important in these battles to mask the Canadians as they move forward. The Canadians drove through Bourlon Wood, and they kept fighting. The Germans responded viciously, throwing forces into the line. 6 divisions they threw against the Canadians, 13 independent machine gun companies to slow the Canadians. The battles on the 28th and the 29th raged almost 24 hours straight on those 2 days, and they saw seesaw engagements of the most fierce kind. From the 29th, Currie sent 2 fresh divisions into the line, a Canadian and a British. And they continued to fight. And all along the front, every day, there were dozens of daily skirmishes that were ultimately won at the platoon and the section level, where infantrymen displayed remarkable skill, grit, and courage. Sir Arthur Currie wrote of these battles, this fighting was the bitterest we had ever experienced. It was attack and counterattack every day of those 5 days. The Canadians continued to inch their way forward, fighting in a series of engagements from the 2nd to the 8th when they finally drove the Germans out of Cambrai. The Germans tried to burn down Cambrai, as you can see from this photograph, and they failed. The Germans' vaunted Hindenburg Line had been shattered. The German army's backbone had been broken. There were battles over the next 5 weeks, small skirmishes, battalion-level engagements, even the set-piece battle at the Battle of Amiens. But I want to focus, as I finish up here, on a little discussed aspect of the 100 Days campaign. One of the key things that we found in our research for this exhibition was the importance of the Canadian soldiers in the liberation of the French and later the Belgian civilians. These civilians had suffered under more than 4 years of cruel occupation. And Jack and I would talk about this, the letters we read from the soldiers who talked about how grateful the French and later the Belgians were. The Kaiser's armies were not the Nazis, but they were not a gentle force. Thousands of French and Belgians were executed during the war. That is documented. Almost all the others suffered systematic looting, beatings, psychological trauma from being under occupation for 4 years. We often think of the end of the Second World War, I think, with the liberated Dutch as a major story of redemption for the loss and carnage of the fighting throughout that terrible conflict. But this, too, also occurred for the Canadian soldier in the Great War. Private William Davidson, just one of many examples I could pick, wrote this: "It made one feel that all this fighting had been worthwhile, to see a people so glad to be delivered from their hard rulers." The fighting had been worthwhile. Everywhere the Canadians went, they were greeted as liberators in the towns and villages. The French crowded them, kissed them, thanked them, wept at their freedom delivered back to them from the terrible sacrifice of the Canadian soldiers. If we think about the First World War as a war of liberation, as many Canadians did at the time, I wonder if this changes how we conceive of the war. Often it's portrayed as a senseless, costly struggle with no goal and nothing accomplished. And yet, with 90% of Belgium occupied and 10% of France occupied, there was a reason to drive back the invaders. Perhaps that is a more nuanced way to think about why Canadians fought and why they kept fighting. The war on the Western Front ended on November 11th, 1918, with the armistice, with the Canadians capturing Mons, a symbolic city from where the British Army had started its retreat in August 1914. The cataclysmic war cost some 9 million battlefield dead and killed millions of additional civilians. Empires were destroyed. The world was remade. There was a dark legacy from this war that Jack has alluded to and that I will continue to talk about in our next lecture on November 8th, and why the war continues to matter 100 years later. Well, to return to 100 years ago and the 100 Days campaign, I want to make it clear that Canada did not win the war single-handedly. I've talked about the Canadian Corps tonight. I'm a Canadian historian. We're in the Canadian War Museum. We're talking about Canada in 1918. But let us not think that Canada won the war single-handedly. Nonetheless, the Canadian Corps punched far above its weight on the battlefield. The 4 Canadian divisions met and defeated elements of 50 German divisions. 50 German divisions. Currie was right to crow of his corps. No force of equal size ever accomplished so much in a similar space of time during the war, and he was right. But they paid for their success. They paid for their victory with more than 45,000 casualties, an eighth of the total losses for the entire British Army. Currie wept for his fallen soldiers. He writes about this in his letters and diaries. He wept for the soldiers. He wept for those families that would receive the next of kin telegrams. And yet often those tears were not seen by the privates at the sharp end. Despite the victory, many felt that they had been pushed too hard for too long and the cost was too high. Now, I would suggest to you that it was and it remains difficult to measure victory on the Western Front. Perhaps some of you here tonight might offer some thoughts in the question period of how we define victory on the Western Front and how much was too much. In our assessment, both Jack and I believe that the 100 Days are Canada's greatest contribution to victory during the war, based on combined arms warfare and a reasonable series of plans by Currie, who is Canada's greatest battlefield general. And yet Jack and I have written in our books, and as will be presented in the 100 Days exhibition, that these battles took incredible courage and endurance on the part of the Canadians at the sharp end. Despite the losses and the strain, somehow they kept going. The infantry at the sharp end were the ones, in the end, who delivered victory. Thanks very much.